He ignored a direct order, Miller. That is unacceptable. Precision is not optional, is mission critical.
Yes, sir.
6:47 in the morning, September 14th, 2019, Fort Ashwood, Texas. I watched Colonel Douglas Hargrove raise his hand in front of 317 soldiers. He didn't know that was the last order his career would ever give. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's not where this story starts. That's where it ends. And before you can understand what that moment meant, before you can feel the weight of that single raised hand and what it cost to stop it, you need to understand what it took to get there. What was built piece by piece in the 6 weeks before it? What was taken? What was endured? And what finally refused to break? So let me take you back to the beginning. August 1st, 2019. The day I arrived at Fort Ashwood, I drove in at 05:30 before the sun had fully committed to the day. The Texas sky was the color of iron, that particular gray that comes just before heat takes over and turns everything brutal. The base materialized out of the flatness, the way military installations always do. First the fences, then the guard towers, then the geometry of buildings that all look alike by design. Fort Ashwood sat on a stretch of central Texas hardpan that hadn't seen meaningful rain in 11 weeks. The ground was cracked. Red clay split open like old leather, and the smell coming through my window was diesel and dry earth and something underneath. Both of those, something older like the land itself, was tired of waiting. I'd been at 4 bases before this one. I knew what they smelled like when they were healthy. I knew what they smelled like when they weren't. Fort Ashwood smelled like the second kind. I parked, cut the engine, and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. My left knee was aching the way it always does in dry heat. The piece of shrapnel still lodged in the joint too close to the nerve bundle to remove safely, according to 3 separate surgeons over 9 years, had a way of measuring barometric pressure more accurately than any weather service. That morning it was telling me the day was going to be hard. I had learned a long time ago not to argue with it. I reached into the back seat, retrieved my cover, put it on, and stepped out of the car. I didn't know then how long I'd be standing at that particular line. I didn't know yet what Fort Ashwood was going to ask of me. But I knew one thing, the same thing I had known since I was 8 years old, watching my father come home from Lejeune in his dress blues and set his cover on the kitchen table without a word, his face carrying something that had no name in our house, but was understood by everyone in it. You do the job, or you don't wear the boots. My name is Nora Wexfield. I was 32 years old when this story happened. I am telling it now because someone needs to. And because enough time has passed that I can do it without my hands shaking. I won't describe myself the way other people might. I'll let the record do it. I graduated top of my officer candidate class in 2008, 21 years old, and certain of very little except that I was willing to do the work. I did my first tour in Kandahar that same year. I came back retrained and went back for a second in 2010. That second tour is where the shrapnel in my left knee came from. It is also where the Purple Heart came from, a commendation I have never once mentioned in conversation. Not because I'm modest, but because the day I earned it was the worst day of my life. And some things don't get turned into talking points. My father was a Marine Corps officer for 24 years. My mother was a high school teacher who believed with genuine conviction that a person who couldn't articulate why they believed something had no business believing it. She had me memorizing Marcus Aurelius before I learned algebra. She said discipline of the mind was the only kind that lasted. She was right. She was right about most things. I joined the Army not because I had something to prove and not because there was nothing else for me. I joined because I believed in the work, and I was good at it, and I knew that good work done quietly, done correctly, done without expectation of applause, that kind of work builds something that can't be handed to you and can't be taken away. I had spent 11 years building it, and then I arrived at Fort Ashwood, and I understood within the first 48 hours that I had walked into a place where someone had spent 6 years burning that kind of work to the ground. Master Sergeant Gareth Lorne found me at the motor pool at 0620. He was a large man, not in a way that announced itself, but in a way you became aware of over time, like a weather system moving in from the west. 15 years in, his face had the quality of old oak weathered past the point of softness, marked by things he'd never fully articulate, and entirely permanently reliable. He shook my hand once firmly and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as careful assessment, not the kind that comes from sizing someone up, but the kind that comes from trying to determine whether someone is what they appear to be or something more. I would learn later that Gareth Lorne had been making that determination about every officer who arrived at Fort Ashwood for the past 4 years. He had been wrong twice. He had been right about everything else. He said, "Captain Wexfield, glad you made it. Not glad you're here. Glad you made it. There was a distinction in that phrasing, and I filed it the way I file everything quietly, precisely for later use. Sergeant Lorne, I said, walk me through the motor pool. He did. And while he walked me through it, while he explained the equipment status and the maintenance backlog and the 3 requisitions that had been sitting in the system for 6 weeks without approval, he watched me. Not obviously, but he watched the way I listened, the way I asked follow-up questions, the way I didn't write anything down because I didn't need to. At the end of the walkthrough, he stopped, looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he said, "You're going to want to be careful the first couple weeks, sir." It wasn't a warning exactly, it was more like a hand laid on a compass, a small, careful gesture meant to orient. I nodded once the way my father had taught me to receive information that mattered. Not too much acknowledgement. Enough. Noted, I said. He held my eyes for one more second, then he went back to work. That was how it started with Lorne. It would take me 3 weeks to fully understand what he had been trying to tell me. By then, I already knew it on my own. The officer orientation briefing was held at 800 in Conference Room B, which was a room that smelled like stale coffee and other people's decisions. There were 11 of us seated when Colonel Douglas Hargrove walked in. He didn't walk in the way most commanding officers walk into a room. There is a particular quality that genuine commanders have, a gravity that precedes them, a sense that the air has to rearrange itself to accommodate them. Hargrove had that quality. But underneath it, if you knew how to look, there was something that didn't quite fit. The best way I can describe it is this: genuine authority doesn't require a room to feel it. It simply exists and the room adjusts. What Hargrove had was performance. Polished, practiced, convincing performance. But performance nonetheless. He was in his mid-50s, dress uniform pressed to a sharpness that spoke of deliberate effort. Medals that told a legitimate story of service. I had done my research before arriving, as I always do. Eyes that moved across the room, not like a leader taking the measure of his people, but like a landlord surveying his property. He sat down at the head of the table, did not open the briefing immediately, let the silence extend just long enough to make every person in the room aware that he was the reason it was silent. Then he opened my personnel file. I watched him read. I have learned over the years that a great deal can be understood by watching someone read a document, the pace of it, the places where the pace changes, the micro-expressions that arrive before the reader has a chance to compose them. His pace changed at my second Kandahar deployment. He read that section twice. Then he turned one more page, saw the Purple Heart notation, and didn't react at all, which told me more than a reaction would have. He closed the folder, looked around the room at nothing in particular, and then, still looking at the table in front of him, in a voice calibrated to be just audible enough for the room, another soft slot filled. The words were quiet. They were meant to be heard but not acknowledged. The kind of comment that operates as a test, said softly enough to be deniable, loudly enough to establish territory. I didn't answer. I held his eyes 1 second longer than I needed to. His expression didn't change. But something in the room shifted, something very small, and the other officers at the table felt it, even if they couldn't have named it. That was where it started. Not with orders, not with documents, not with the machinery of military hierarchy, which would come later. It started with a silence and a stare, and the decision which I made in that moment, quietly and completely, that I was not going to be the 4th officer to walk away from Fort Ashwood without having done what I came to do. The first week I did what I always do in a new environment. I watched. I listened. I went to every briefing, reviewed every report, read the maintenance logs and the supply chain records and the personnel evaluations going back 18 months. I walked the base at 05:30 every morning, partly because the heat was still manageable then, and my knee appreciated it, and partly because a base in the early morning before it puts on its official face will tell you things it wouldn't tell you any other time. What Fort Ashwood told me was this: the people here were good. The enlisted men and women were capable, disciplined, and by and large committed to the work in the way career soldiers are, not through enthusiasm, but through something harder and more durable, through the kind of ownership that develops when you've been doing something long enough that it becomes part of who you are. But there was a tension beneath the surface of daily operations that didn't belong. It was present in the way junior officers checked themselves before speaking in formal settings, in the way certain requests moved through channels with unusual slowness, in the particular quality of silence that fell over any room when Hargrove entered it, not the silence of respect, which I know well, but the silence of calculation. The silence of people deciding in real time how much of themselves was safe to show. I recognized that silence. I'd encountered versions of it before in organizations where the person at the top had confused authority with ownership, where the command structure had stopped being a mechanism for accomplishing the mission and had become instead a mechanism for managing the commander's ego. I filed what I observed. I didn't act on it yet. There is a discipline, my father called it patience with purpose, which is different from ordinary patience that separates adequate officers from effective ones. The ability to accumulate information without acting prematurely, to hold what you know against what you don't yet know and wait for the picture to resolve itself. I was building a picture. The supply chain briefing was on a Thursday, 8 days after my arrival. Each department head presented a status report. When my turn came, I presented what I had found methodically clearly, the way you present things that matter. 3 specific inconsistencies in the southern perimeter supply drops, each documented, each with a proposed correction, each cross-referenced with standing protocol. I had spoken for approximately 4 minutes when Hargrove raised one hand. Not to ask a question, not to request clarification. A dismissal, the way you wave away something that has become an inconvenience. We'll stick to the standard process. A pause precisely waited. I'm not here for micromanagement from junior officers. The room went still. Junior officers. I was a captain. I was next in the command chain if anything happened to him. Every person in that room knew it. This wasn't a mistake in rank recognition. It was a statement of position, public, deliberate, and aimed. Nobody spoke. I looked at him. I nodded once the way my father taught me to receive information that matters. Then I sat down. From the back of the room where Lorne was standing in his capacity as senior NCO on duty, I noticed a small shift in his posture. Almost nothing, but in the language of a man who spent 15 years expressing everything important in understatement, it meant something. Later, passing him in the motor pool, I said quietly without slowing, "I know." He said just as quietly, "There it is." 3 days later, I found the memo. It had been distributed to all department heads as an internal operations document issued under Hargrove's name. It was a tactical analysis of supply chain vulnerabilities along the southern perimeter. It proposed 3 specific corrections, each cross-referenced with standing protocol. They were my words, every sentence. He had changed 4 of them. Not for accuracy, the changes didn't improve anything. They were changes made to obscure authorship without altering substance. Small alterations, the kind you would only notice if you had written the original yourself. I read it twice sitting at my desk in the late afternoon light that came through the window at a low angle, making the text on the page look like it was lit from beneath. That was the moment I understood what kind of war this was. Not a war of confrontation, not a war of direct assault, a war of erosion, of steady, quiet theft, of taking what someone builds and reissuing it as your own until the person who built it begins to question whether they built anything at all. It is a particular kind of cruelty because it targets not just your position, but your certainty about your own competence. I had seen it used before on other people. I had never had it used on me. I folded the memo, put it in my desk drawer, sat very still for a moment. Then I opened my notebook and started writing. Not the tactical analysis, something else. A log, date time incident documentation. The first entry was brief, 2 sentences, signed with my initials and the time. The second entry came 3 days later, then the third. I stopped counting after that. Private Cal Fenwick was 19 years old and had been at Fort Ashwood for 4 months. He was the kind of young soldier who reminds you why this work matters, not because he was exceptional in any obvious way, but because he was sincere. He believed in the Army the way young men do before they've had cause to separate the institution from the ideal it represents. His uniform was never perfectly pressed, but his eyes were always completely attentive. He paid attention not to impress anyone, but because that was simply the kind of person he was. I noticed him during my first week. Not for anything dramatic, he asked a good question during a field exercise, a logistical question that most privates wouldn't have thought to ask. I answered it. He nodded and wrote it down in a small green notebook. He wrote everything down. I recognized that quality in him, the way you recognize something in another person that you also carry yourself. The letter arrived in my on-base mailbox at the end of my second week. No return address, handwritten on plain paper. 5 words. He's losing face. Be ready. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it and put it in the same drawer as the memo. I didn't know yet who had written it. I had my suspicions. But in the early days of something like this, certainty is more important than proximity to the truth, and I wasn't certain yet. I was, however, ready. The endurance trial came on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of August, unannounced, issued to my unit and my unit alone. Full kit, full gear under a Texas sun that by 0900 had already pushed past 94 degrees and was still climbing. The red clay of the exercise ground radiated heat upward from below, as well as driving it down from above, so that you existed inside the temperature rather than beneath it. I learned afterward that Hargrove had arranged for a camera crew-based medium officially for training documentation purposes. I understood immediately what it was for. He wanted footage. He wanted the record of my unit struggling, cracking under conditions that had been deliberately engineered to produce that outcome. He wanted something he could put in a file and point to. This is what her command looks like. This is the quality of soldier she produces. This is what happens when a soft slot gets filled. He made a mistake. He forgot who he was trying to break. I stood at the start line and looked at my unit. 28 soldiers, ages 19 to 31. Fenwick at the near end of the line, chin strap unclipped the way young soldiers keep it until you tell them twice. Sergeant Ellis at the center. Specialist Harker squinting into the sun with the expression of someone who has stopped pretending the heat is tolerable. All of them looking at me. Fenwick looked at me the way young soldiers look at officers when they're about to do something hard, and they need to know whether the officer is the kind who does it with them or the kind who watches from somewhere cooler. His expression was not quite a question and not quite a test. It was something more honest than either. He said, "You don't have to do this with us, ma'am." I clipped my own chin strap, slung my rifle, felt the weight of the full kit settle across my shoulders the way it always does. Familiar, not pleasant, but known. My left knee registered its opinion of the morning's plan. I noted it and set it aside. I said, if they want to see me break, they'll have to watch me run first. We moved out. The circuit was designed to punish. 4 miles of broken terrain, carrying weight timed at intervals with reaction tasks built into 3 points along the road. In August, heat-full kit, it was the kind of trial that finds the places in a person where the body's objections begin to get louder than the mind's instructions. My left knee communicated its situation approximately 1 mile in. The shrapnel, the heat, the impact of boots on hardpan. It produced a specific quality of discomfort that I have trained myself to categorize as information rather than obstacle. I had run harder courses on worse mornings, and I had learned years ago exactly how loud that knee was allowed to get before I needed to make a decision about it. That morning it did not get loud enough. I did not fall back. I did not slow down. I ran the circuit the same way I ran every circuit, putting one foot in front of the next with deliberate, unspectacular consistency, which is the only way anything worth doing ever actually gets done. My unit finished first, every single one of them. From the observation tower, I was aware of Hargrove in my peripheral vision. I did not look directly at him, but I saw him fold the clipboard under his arm from 30 yards away. I saw the set of his jaw. He had come to watch a defeat. He had gotten a data point that worked against him. Men like Hargrove, men who have used their position as a weapon for long enough, have a particular response to that kind of outcome. They don't walk away from the campaign. They change the weapon. I knew finishing that circuit with my knee burning and the sun pressing down on the back of my neck, that whatever came next would be less visible, more precise. The kind of fighting that doesn't leave marks you can point to but leaves marks nonetheless. I was right, but that evening I found something else. Taped to the outside of my quarters door. No name, no note, just a single folded piece of paper. Inside it, a sketch rendered in rough pencil lines on plain white paper. A soldier standing at a line facing forward. Behind the soldier, a shadow enormous, one hand raised. The soldier was not looking back. Above the drawing, 5 words in careful block letters. Strength isn't loud. It just doesn't move. I stood in the corridor for a moment holding the paper. Then I took it inside. I placed it on the desk next to the memo and the letter. 3 pieces of paper, each one telling a different part of the same story. The theft, the warning, the drawing. I sat down. The base was going quiet around me, the particular quiet of late evening, when the day's work is over, but the next day hasn't started yet. Through the window, the lights of the motor pool were still on, which meant Lorne was working late. He was often working late. I thought about what my mother used to say when I was young and facing something that felt too large to approach directly. She would sit across the kitchen table with her hands folded and say, "Nora, still water runs deep." And still water cuts the hardest. She meant it as an observation about character, about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, about the fact that the most powerful forces in nature are not always the ones that make the most noise. I closed the notebook, put the drawing in my top desk drawer, turned off the light, lay down on the cot, because whatever Fort Ashwood was going to ask of me, whatever Hargrove was going to bring, I was going to need to be rested. The next morning, I was up at 05:30. I put on my boots, and I went to work. The week after the endurance trial, Hargrove stopped fighting in the open. I had expected that. Men who operate the way he operated through accumulated pressure, through the steady erosion of another person's credibility, they don't change tactics because they want to. They change because the old tactics have stopped working. The endurance trial had been a public move, a direct play, and it had not produced what he needed. In front of the base, in front of his camera crew, my unit had finished first, and I had run every foot of it alongside them. That wasn't supposed to happen. So the open fighting stopped, and the other kind began. The other kind is harder to name and harder to document, and in some ways harder to survive than anything done in daylight, because it works on the inside rather than the outside. It doesn't leave marks you can photograph. It leaves doubt. It leaves the slow, corrosive question of whether what you're experiencing is real, or whether you're reading intention into coincidence, grievance, into administrative procedure, malice, into the ordinary friction of a large institution running on limited resources. I had seen it done to others. I knew exactly what it was. The first supply requisition I submitted after the trial came back denied. Budget review period, the reason said. I submitted it again through a different channel. Denied again, same reason, a different language. The third time it disappeared into the system entirely and generated no response, which is a particular category of bureaucratic erasure that requires active effort to produce. It does not happen on its own. 2 training drills I had scheduled for the 3rd week of August were canceled without notice. My soldiers showed up at the exercise ground and found it empty. The cancellation orders, when I tracked them down, had been issued 20 minutes before the drills were set to begin, routed through a logistics channel I didn't have direct access to. By the time I located them, the window had closed. The promotion recommendations I had submitted for 3 soldiers, Fenwick Ellis and Specialist Harker, all of whom had earned it and earned it clearly, had been received, acknowledged, and set aside. Not denied, set aside, which is worse because set aside means they're technically still pending, which means they can't be appealed, which means the people who deserve something simply wait and begin to understand that the waiting is the answer. None of this was provable in the way I could use. Each incident had a plausible administrative explanation. Each one taken alone was noise. Taken together, they were a signal, precise, sustained, and aimed. I kept writing in the notebook. Date, time, incident, documentation. Every entry. Then on the last Monday of August in the motor pool just after 1800, Gareth Lorne changed everything. The motor pool in the early evening had a particular quality I had come to value over the previous weeks. The work crews were finishing for the day, the generators running at low frequency, the light coming in at a low angle through the west-facing bay doors and laying long shadows across the concrete floor. Lorne was the last one working, as he often was. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and he was going over a maintenance log with the methodical attention of a man who treats careful work as a form of respect for the work itself. He heard me come in, didn't look up immediately. When he did, he held out his right hand to shake mine. It was a formal gesture for an informal moment, and I registered it immediately as deliberate. His grip was firm. His palm was calloused in the way that hands get calloused after years of working with metal and rope and the physical infrastructure of military life, rough in all the right places, carrying the texture of every unglamorous task he had completed without complaint over 15 years. And something about that grip, the specific weight of it, took me somewhere else entirely. Kandahar, June 14th, 2010. Mine are not flashbacks in the way some people describe them, where the present disappears and the past takes its place. Mine are overlays. The present stays present, but something from before lays itself on top of it, and for a moment you are inhabiting both simultaneously. I was in both places at once, the motor pool, the late light, Lorne's hand releasing, and a road in Kandahar province, 700, a Humvee on its side and burning. I had been 40 meters away when it happened. The blast wave knocked me sideways. When I got up, I was already running, and my left knee was producing a sensation I recognized as serious and was not prepared to acknowledge, not in that particular moment, with 2 soldiers still inside a burning vehicle. Private Reardon was unconscious. Corporal Marsh was conscious and saying things that didn't fully reach me because the hearing in my right ear had been temporarily suspended by the concussive force. I got them both out. The vehicle was on fire and the fire had no patience. And by the time I had them both clear, my left knee had communicated its condition in terms that were no longer ignorable. I sat in the dirt beside the road with Reardon's head on my lap and waited for the medics. A sergeant whose name I have since let go put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "You shouldn't have been able to do that." I said, I know. He said, how did you? I looked at the black smoke against the absolutely blue sky and thought about it honestly. I said, I've survived worse. It wasn't entirely true at that point, but saying it made it true in the way that matters, in the way that carries you through the rest of the day and the day after that and all the days following. I learned something sitting in the dust of that road. The body does what the mind tells it to if the mind is clear enough. If the mind refuses to negotiate with the body's objections. If the mind simply will not accept the option of stopping. That was what I carried with me back to the motor pool as the overlay faded and the present reasserted itself. Lauren's hand releasing the motor pool lights, the maintenance log on the workbench. He was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Something between concern and certainty moving slowly from one toward the other. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a USB drive on the workbench between us. He said 17 months. He didn't explain further. He went back to his maintenance log. I put the drive in my pocket and walked back to my quarters. I don't think I slept that night. Not from anxiety. Anxiety is a kind of static, and what I felt that night was the opposite of static. It was the sharp, clean clarity of a picture beginning to resolve. The feeling of pieces that had been separate starting to find their arrangement. The drive contained files organized with the methodical precision of a man who had been waiting a long time for the right moment to hand them to the right person. 17 months of documentation. Every instance he could establish. Every bypass of command protocol. Every requisition delay traceable to a single origin. Every memo that had arrived under Hargrove's name, carrying language that had started somewhere else. There were names I recognized. Situations I had already logged in my own notebook, now corroborated with detail I hadn't had access to. And then there was a name I didn't recognize. Lieutenant Dorian Webb. He had been at Fort Ashwood from early 2017 to July 2018. 18 months. The file on Webb was the longest on the drive, and it took me the better part of an hour to read it fully. Webb had done what I had done. He had arrived, assessed the situation, documented what he found, and begun to build a case. He was, by every account in the record, a capable officer who understood exactly what was happening to him and exactly what it would cost him to say so. In July 2018, his personnel file had been placed under administrative review. The grounds were vague in the way that administrative grounds are always vague when vagueness is the point. What was not vague was the practical consequence. While the review was pending, Webb could not be transferred, could not be promoted, and could not submit formal complaints through standard channels without those complaints being routed through the review process itself, which was controlled by the same office that had initiated it. A clean trap. Webb had signed a voluntary transfer request and left Fort Ashwood on July 19, 2018. The word voluntary appeared in the documentation 3 times, which is 2 times more than something genuinely voluntary needs to be described. I sat at my desk for a long time after finishing. Then I added the USB drive to the drawer alongside the memo, the letter, and the drawing. I opened my notebook to a fresh page, and I started building. The next morning at 5:30, I spread everything across my desk in the sequence I would eventually present it. Not because I had an audience yet, but because the act of arranging evidence in order is itself preparation. It trains the mind on the argument, makes it physical, lets you identify the gaps before someone else does. I worked through it with care. The tactical analysis, the original with its metadata intact, time-stamped and authored, the distributed version issued under Hargrove's name with its 4 altered sentences. Side by side, they were unambiguous. This was not interpretation. This was documentation of a specific act repeated with confidence. Over time, the confidence of a man who had never been held accountable and had stopped expecting to be. The requisition denials, dates, submission routes, stated reasons cross-referenced with base-wide budget records that showed no general budget review in the relevant period. The denials were selective. The selectivity had a pattern. The pattern had a source. The transfer history. 3 officers before Webb. Webb's administrative review and the constructed mechanism of it. 4 people, 4 years, 1 system used the same way each time. And Lauren's audio files, 14 recordings, each one a specific instance of Hargrove communicating directly with soldiers in my unit without routing through my command. Each one time-stamped. Each one unambiguous. I looked at it all arranged on the desk. First, the analysis. Metadata confirms original authorship, his name on my words. Second, the supply records. Selective delays with no legitimate basis traceable to a single decision point. Third, the transfer pattern. 4 officers, 4 years, 1 mechanism. The same trap rebuilt each time by someone who believed he could keep building it indefinitely. I had spent 11 years learning how systems work, how they are designed to function, and how they fail, and how the failure is sometimes constructed rather than accidental. I had learned this from doctrine and field experience, and from watching good people ground down by institutions that should have protected them. Now I was going to use that knowledge for exactly the purpose it was meant for. I was not going to act yet. What I had was foundation. What I needed was the final piece, the one that converted pattern into proof, interpretation into documented fact. I didn't know yet that Hargrove was about to give it to me. He didn't know it either. The second Monday of September, he made his move. It came as an order issued directly to Sergeant Ellis, bypassing my command entirely. The order was operational, a change to patrol positioning along the eastern perimeter. It was within Hargrove's authority to issue operationally, but not within protocol to issue without routing through the unit commander, which was me. The distinction matters, not because of hierarchy for its own sake, but because command integrity is not a formality. It is the mechanism by which soldiers in the field know whose instructions they are following and what the chain of accountability is when something goes wrong. Undermining that mechanism repeatedly and deliberately is not an administrative inconvenience. It is a danger. Ellis received the order and did what a sergeant does when a colonel issues a direct instruction. He followed it. He would have been wrong not to. The failure was not Ellis's. What I did not know until later was that Cal Fenwick had been standing 12 feet from Ellis when the order was given. Fenwick had his phone on him. He pressed record before the order was completed. 43 seconds of audio. Hargrove's voice clear and unambiguous, issuing a direct operational order to a soldier in my unit without reference to my command. 43 seconds that would later become one of the most significant pieces of documentation in the formal record. Lorne had told Fenwick sometime in the preceding weeks in plain terms, when it happens again, document it. A 19-year-old private did what he was told and pressed a button. And in doing so, he did what a room full of officers with far more authority and far less courage would not. I didn't know about the recording yet. I would learn about it later, when the pieces came together and the picture resolved into something beyond argument. In the meantime, there was Major Elliot Branford. Branford had been at Fort Ashwood for 3 years. He was competent in the way certain career officers are competent, reliably, professionally, and entirely within the boundaries of what was expected of him. He had in 3 years never exceeded those boundaries in any direction. I had identified him early as someone who understood what was happening on this base and had made a choice about what that understanding required. Or more precisely, had made the choice that it required nothing. He was present at many of the moments that mattered, not involved present, a witness in the technical sense, watching with the careful distance of a man who had calculated the cost of involvement and found it exceeding his budget. I stopped expecting anything from Branford by the second week of September. There are people in every institution who represent the condition that makes abuse of power sustainable. Not the people who perpetrate it, but the people who see it clearly and do nothing. They are not villains. They are something more complicated and in some ways more difficult to account for, because their capacity for decency is visible and their choice not to deploy it is entirely their own. I had no anger left for Branford. I had noted him, assessed him, and moved past him. What I did not anticipate was that the moment he finally spoke would come when it mattered most. The countdown appeared in my mind on a Sunday evening. I had received word through routine administrative channels that a Pentagon review board was scheduled to arrive at Fort Ashwood on September 17th. Standard operational review installations of Fort Ashwood's size and function received them on a regular cycle. Nothing unusual in the notification itself. What was significant was the date. September 17th was 72 hours after September 14th. I did not know on that Sunday what September 14th would specifically bring. What I knew was that the pressure had been building for 6 weeks and that Hargrove had exhausted the visible options and most of the invisible ones, and that men who have spent years operating without consequence develop a belief that the absence of consequences is permanent rather than merely extended. That belief makes them dangerous in a specific way. It makes them willing to do in desperation what they would not have done in patience. Something was going to happen before that review board arrived. I lay down, went to sleep, woke at 4:30. I ran 3 miles before the sun came up. The exercise perimeter in the pre-dawn dark, my knee measuring the morning in its particular language, the ground still holding the previous day's heat in a way that made the air close and thick. By the time I finished, I had the shape of what was coming, not the specific form of it, but the weight and direction of it, and I had decided in the way you decide things, when there is no longer any point in postponing the decision, that I was ready. On September 14th, 2019 at 0600, I dressed in full field uniform. The live fire maneuver had been scheduled for 0700. My unit. Multi-element coordinated exercise requiring sustained attention and clear command communication. I had prepared the positioning framework the previous evening, reviewed the terrain analysis, confirmed the communication protocols with Ellis at 0530. At 0650, I walked out onto the exercise ground. The morning was already hot. The kind of September heat that has stopped pretending fall is on its way. Above the observation tower, the flag moved in a wind too light to feel at ground level. 317 soldiers assembled on the exercise ground. I want you to hold that number as a physical reality, not as a statistic. 317 human beings in uniforms standing in formation on flat Texas hardpan as the morning light grew over the perimeter fence. The sound of that many people in disciplined silence is not actually silence. It is the sound of 317 people breathing the small adjustments of bodies at attention, a collective presence that has weight and texture to it. I took my position. The exercise began. 11 minutes in, I saw the vulnerability on the left flank. Standard tactical assessment. The second element's positioning had created a gap in the left coverage that in a live scenario would represent a clear and exploitable point of entry. The protocol was unambiguous. Unit commanders have not merely the authority, but the obligation to call a field reposition when they identify a tactical vulnerability during active training. This is not discretionary. This is the requirement. I issued the reposition order. Clear, direct, per established protocol. The response came from the sideline. His voice crossed the exercise ground like something thrown hard. "Captain Wexfield." I turned. He was moving toward me from the edge of the field, not running, but close to it. The particular stride of a man whose anger has gotten ahead of his judgment. The formation held, but the quality of its holding changed. 317 people understanding simultaneously that what was unfolding was no longer training. Who gave you the authority to override my formation? I observed a vulnerability on the left flank. Field reposition per protocol. That is not your call to make. He was 6 feet from me, then 4, the distance at which personal space becomes contested rather than professional. It is exactly my call to make, I said. Per the protocol you issued last month. He stopped at 4 feet, then stepped closer. I want to be precise about what I did next because precision is the only thing that survives what follows moments like this one. I did not move. This was the most deliberate choice I made in 6 weeks of deliberate choices, because I understood that what happened next would be seen by every person on that field, and I understood that what they saw needed to be unambiguous. Not an argument about who said what, not a dispute about protocol that could be read 2 ways, something that could not be explained away or reframed or reduced to he said, she said, in a report filed 6 floors above the exercise ground. I needed every soldier on that field to see exactly what was happening before I did anything about it. He stepped into my space, closer than regulation, closer than anything describable as professional interaction. His breath was in my face and his eyes had the particular quality of a man who has run out of institutional levers and has decided that what comes next doesn't have to be institutional. You think you can embarrass me in front of my men. The words were meant to land as an accusation. They landed as a confession. They're not your men, I said. My voice was level. Sir, the shoulder went back slightly. The weight shifted. And then in the specific, identifiable way that 11 years of combat training had prepared me to read, his right arm moved. Not a warning, not a gesture of frustration. A strike deliberate and aimed with the particular precision of someone who has decided that consequences are something that happen to other people. I want to be precise about what happened next. His shoulder rotated forward. The arm came up. The motion was committed. My left hand came up to meet it. I had trained Krav Maga since I was 21. I had trained close quarters combat through 2 combat deployments. I had drilled the specific sequence required to neutralize an overhead strike, wrist catch pivot leverage step through 10,000 times over 11 years. Not as a thought process, as a reflex. The body executing what the mind had spent years preparing it to execute in a situation the mind had long ago decided how to answer. Catch, pivot, leverage, step through. The sound crossed the exercise ground before I had completed the final movement. A single sharp crack like a live round. Hargrove went to one knee. His right arm was at an angle that arms are not designed to achieve. His face was the face of a man who has experienced something that has not yet translated into language, the shock arriving before the pain, the understanding arriving before either. I released him immediately, 1 step back, no more than that. My voice when I found it was the same voice I had used in the dirt outside Kandahar 9 years earlier, telling a sergeant something that needed to be true before it was entirely true, because that is how you get through what the day still requires. You will never raise your hand to me again, Colonel. The words went across the exercise ground, and there was nothing after them, not a sound, not a movement. 317 soldiers in a silence so complete you could hear the flag moving in the wind above the observation tower. From somewhere across the field, a medic was already running. I turned, deliberately. I looked at the formation, not at any single face, but at all of them, moving from soldier to soldier in a way I hope conveyed what I needed it to convey. I am still here. The mission continues. So do you. Formation remains intact, I said. They obeyed. Later after the drill was called, and the field had cleared, and the sound of what had happened had settled into the hard pan, Branford and Lorne were standing together near the edge of the exercise ground. I did not hear most of what passed between them. What I caught was the end of it as I walked past on my way back to the administrative wing. Branford was staring at the place where Hargrove had gone down. His face had the expression of a man completing a calculation that had taken him 14 months to arrive at. He said quietly to no one he expected to hear him, "I should have said something 14 months ago." Lorne didn't answer. I kept walking. I understood what Branford had done and what he had failed to do, and what the gap between those two things had cost Dorian Webb and 3 officers before him. I was not going to tell him it was acceptable, because it was not, and he knew it, and sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone who has made a consequential mistake is to let them understand that you know they made it. I walked across the exercise ground through the September heat, past the equipment and the dispersing soldiers, and the particular quality of attention that follows a moment that cannot be taken back. My left knee had its usual things to say. I told it what I always told it. We are not done yet. The administrative wing of Fort Ashwood was the quietest part of the base. Not the quiet of nothing happening, but the deliberate quiet of a space designed for a particular kind of work, the work of record and consequence, of determining what things mean and what they cost. Every other part of a military installation carries sound: the motor pool, the barracks, the exercise grounds. The administrative wing was built to hold a different kind of weight. That morning, it was quieter than I had ever heard it. A corporal I didn't recognize escorted me to conference room C. He was careful not to meet my eyes in the way people are careful when they know something about your situation that they have been instructed not to discuss. We walked the main corridor and stopped at the third door on the left. He opened it. I went in. Colonel Warren Whitfield was already seated. He had flown in from the Pentagon, which I had been informed of in advance, and could have determined independently from the particular quality of presence belonging to someone who has arrived from outside the situation rather than being embedded in it. He had the advantage of distance and the disadvantage of not having been here. He could see the shape of things without having lived inside them. He was in his late 40s, gray at the temples, a face built for professional neutrality, not cold but without ease. He had a legal pad in front of him and several printed documents positioned to his right. On the screen behind him, split into 3 panels, was the footage. 3 cameras, 3 angles. The same 11 seconds cycling on a loop. I knew what I looked like in that footage. I had run the sequence in my mind often enough in the hours since the exercise ground and the reposition order. Hargrove crossing the field. The confrontation, the strike that didn't land, the one that did. Watching it on a screen in a fluorescent-lit conference room, I felt neither regret nor satisfaction. What I felt was the focused stillness of someone who has done a necessary thing and is now prepared to account for it precisely. He paused the feed. He looked at me the way people look at a document before beginning to read it, establishing its presence, its weight. "Have a seat, Captain." I sat. He said, "Colonel Hargrove's radius is fractured. You broke it in front of 317 soldiers during an active training exercise." "His arm was in motion," I said. "I stopped the strike before it completed. The footage confirms the arm was in motion." "The footage confirms that." A pause. "It also confirms that you used force against a superior officer." "It confirms that I used minimum force to stop an assault being committed by a superior officer." "Those are not the same statement, sir." He looked at me steadily. Then he wrote something on his legal pad. "Walk me through your decision process," and he said. I had thought about how to answer this. Not to construct a version of events. The events were documented on 3 camera angles and were not subject to interpretation, but because clarity requires preparation, and preparation is what I do. I identified the tactical vulnerability at approximately 11 minutes into the maneuver, I said. I issued a field reposition per established protocol. Colonel Hargrove challenged the order and advanced on my position. When he entered my personal space, I held my position deliberately. I needed the soldiers present to observe the situation without any ambiguity before I responded to it. When his right arm initiated a strike, I used a wrist catch and controlled takedown to neutralize it. I released him immediately upon completion of the technique. One movement, no continuation of force applied. Whitfield wrote for several seconds. "Why didn't you de-escalate?" he said. "I did," I said. I absorbed the verbal confrontation without response. I held my position through his advance. I did not counter-escalate at any point until the moment a physical strike was initiated. I de-escalated every element that could be de-escalated. At the point of physical initiation, de-escalation was no longer the applicable response. Stopping the strike was. He put his pen down. He looked at the screen where the footage was paused, Hargrove on one knee, my hand in the act of releasing his wrist. Then he reached to his right and rested his hand on the document stack I had noted earlier. It was not a small stack. He said, "Since the incident, I have received 41 unsolicited statements." I noted the number without reacting to it. "They came through multiple channels," he continued. "Official complaint, procedures, personal correspondence, physical delivery, anonymous and signed, enlisted an officer." He paused. "They are consistent." He met my eyes directly for the first time. "They say this was not impulse. They say this was the conclusion of something that should have been stopped considerably earlier by people with the authority to stop it. They say that what you did on that exercise ground was the result of 6 weeks of documented and sustained interference with your command, and that the restraint you demonstrated stopping when you did releasing, immediately issuing no further action, was itself a form of professionalism under circumstances that would have broken the composure of most officers." He let that sit. "They're accurate on all points," I said. He exhaled. The exhale of a man who has been handed something that is uncomplicated in the factual sense and deeply complicated in the institutional sense. He reached into his folder and removed a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the table. "Administrative suspension pending formal review," he said. "No disciplinary notation at this stage. The review will incorporate the full documented record." I looked at the paper. I picked it up. "Is there anything else you want to say before we close this session?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment. There were many things I could have said. I said the one that was most important. "Dorian Webb," I said, "whatever this review determines about me, make sure his file gets looked at properly. He deserved better than what Fort Ashwood gave him." Whitfield wrote the name down carefully. I stood, took the suspension paper, and left. The corridor was empty. I stood in the fluorescent quiet for a moment. Outside, through the window at the end of the hall, I could see the exercise ground, flat red, still holding the morning light at a low angle across its surface. I folded the suspension paper and put it in my breast pocket. Then I walked outside. Small groups of soldiers were gathered in the exterior common areas, dispersed in the informal clusters that form when something large has happened and the structure of official activity hasn't yet reconvened to absorb it. Conversations happening in low voices. People standing near each other without quite knowing what to say, which is its own form of solidarity. I walked through them. I didn't stop. Some of them looked at me as I passed, not with judgment, with something I took a moment to name correctly. Recognition. The specific quality of recognition that comes not from knowing someone's rank and assignment, but from having watched who they are when it mattered. Lorne was waiting near the pathway connecting the administrative wing to the barracks. He said, "They taking you off the line." "Pending review," I said, "until they decide whether stopping an assault is still punishable." He was quiet. He looked out toward the exercise ground, the red clay flat and empty in the afternoon light. "This base needed a reckoning," he said. "You lit the fuse, Wes." I looked at the same ground. "Note," I said. "Dorian Webb lit it. I just refused to let it go out." Lorne considered this for a moment. Then he said, "The note, in your locker, first week." I looked at him. "Seemed like you needed to know someone was watching," he said. He held my eyes for a moment, that same careful assessment I had received from him on the first morning, which I now understood was not assessment at all. It was recognition that had been waiting for the right moment to become visible. I nodded. That was exactly what I had needed, and he had known it before I knew it myself. What I did not know yet was what was still moving through channels I couldn't see. It came to me in pieces, as most things that matter do not as a single revelation, but as an accumulation of smaller ones, each adjusting the picture slightly until the picture you end up with is recognizably different from the one you started with. The first piece came the following morning. Whitfield called me back to conference room C at 800. He was alone. The footage was gone from the screen. In its place was a single document printed face down on the table between us. He said, "I need to read you something." I sat. He turned the document over. "This statement was received at 2300 hours last night," he said. "Submitted through official channels, signed and witnessed. The submitter requested no anonymity." He looked at me before he began, the look of a man preparing himself for a sentence he had not expected to be delivering. The signatory is Captain Roland Vess. I had met Vess 3 times in my 6 weeks at Fort Ashwood. He was quiet in the way certain people are quiet when they have organized their entire professional existence around not being noticed. Hargrove's aide for 4 years. Not a remarkable figure, not an unremarkable one. The kind of person who exists in the peripheral vision of a command structure, present at everything visible, in nothing accountable for less than he witnessed. I had assessed him early and moved past him. I had been wrong about what he was capable of, given the right pressure from the right direction at the right moment. Whitfield read. The statement was 3 pages single-spaced in the careful and methodical language of a man who had spent a long time deciding what he was going to say and wanted no ambiguity when he finally said it. Vess confirmed every element of the documented pattern. The memo theft, the selective requisition denials, the command bypass. He confirmed them not as an outside observer, but as a participant, not a willing one, but a participant nonetheless. The logistics of certain denials had passed through his hands. The timing of certain administrative actions had been calibrated with his knowledge and in some cases his assistance. But the center of the statement, the part that changed the picture most significantly, was about Dorian Webb. I listened to Whitfield read it and kept my face at the level of professional composure I had been maintaining in formal settings for 11 years. Underneath that composure, I felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but occupied the space between them, the specific weight of learning that what you had suspected was not only true, but was worse in its specifics than you had imagined. Webb had not left voluntarily. Whitfield read this sentence with the flatness of a man who understands the sentence deserves more than flatness, but who is not yet in a position to give it anything else. Webb's personnel file had been placed under administrative review by Hargrove's direct instruction. The review had been constructed with a specific purpose to create a legal mechanism preventing Webb from pursuing the complaint he had been building. A clean trap exactly as I had characterized it from the documents on Lauren's drive. But the drive hadn't shown me who had built it. Vess had built it. Not because he wanted to, because he had been given a direct instruction by his commanding officer and had not found in himself at that particular moment what Webb had found and what I had found, the capacity to absorb the cost of refusing. He had carried that for 14 months. The statement ended near its final paragraph in language that was quiet in the way that very heavy things are quiet. Captain Wexfield stood in the same place Lieutenant Webb stood. She did not move. I understand now what that cost because I understand what it cost Webb when he moved and what it cost me to be the reason he had to. Whitfield set the statement down. The room was very still. I said, "Is Webb's file being reviewed?" "As of this morning," Whitfield said. I nodded. "Then we're done here." He looked at me for a moment. "We're not quite done, Captain." He was right. Hargrove was escorted from the base hospital that afternoon. I did not witness it. I was in my quarters reviewing the suspension documentation when it happened. But I heard about it within the hour in the way you hear about everything significant at a military base, not through official channels, but through the distributed awareness of people who pay attention and know each other. He left in civilian clothes. One aide, a vehicle waiting at the side entrance, not the main gate. No press statement from the base. His attorney released a statement through an outside channel that afternoon. I read it that evening. It used the phrase career assassination twice and invoked with apparent confidence the term toxic feminism, which told me more about the attorney's understanding of the situation than it did about any element of what had actually occurred. The response from veteran communities was immediate and significant. Lauren came to my door that evening with his phone. He showed me a discussion thread that had been running for 4 hours and had accumulated several hundred responses. Posts from former Fort Ashwood personnel and people who knew them. Not uniformly angry or not only angry, clear in the specific way that people are clear when they have been waiting for a moment that gives them permission to say what they already know. Account after account of the pattern. The climate of compliance, the fate of those who pushed back the institutional machinery that had made 6 years possible. The phrase circulating most widely was simple. 6 words appearing on photographs of rank insignia being removed from uniforms attached to statements both personal and formal. Protect those who protect each other. I put the phone down. I did not feel triumphant. What I felt was something closer to what you feel when an infection that has been untreated for a long time is finally properly addressed, not pleasure but relief. And beneath the relief, the factual understanding that treating an infection is not the same as healing, and healing takes longer, and the work of it is quieter and harder than the work of the crisis. 3 weeks later, I received word through official channels that Colonel Douglas Hargrove had been referred for a formal court-martial proceeding. Charges included conduct unbecoming an officer, abuse of command authority, and 1 count of documented personnel coercion relating specifically to the case of Lieutenant Dorian Webb. The proceeding was still pending when I left Fort Ashwood, but pending is not the same as buried. I had learned to know the difference between those 2 words with the precision of someone who had watched one disguise itself as the other for 6 weeks. Webb himself called me on a Wednesday morning in October. I did not know he had my number. He did not explain how he got it. His voice on the line was the voice of someone who had spent 14 months carrying something and had recently set it down and was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. He said simply, "I heard what happened. I wanted you to know it mattered." I said, "It mattered before I knew your name." There was a pause. Then he said, "Yeah." That was the whole conversation. It was enough. The summons to General Huxley's office came 2 days after Hargrove's departure. I had been in Huxley's office twice before, both times in routine command capacity. He was a careful man, a career general who knew exactly where the institutional lines were and operated with consistent precision relative to them. Not the kind of officer who inspired loyalty through personal risk. A man of professional integrity, which is its own kind of value and which I had come to assess honestly rather than dismissively. When I arrived, 2 men were in the room, Huxley seated at his desk, and Brigadier General Aldrich Caldwell standing near the window. Caldwell had arrived from Army headquarters 48 hours earlier. His function was clear institutional response to an event that had grown beyond the installation's capacity to contain it. He was there to manage, which is what generals do when the thing requiring management is the story of what happened, rather than the event itself. He was in his early 60s, the bearing of a man who has worn a uniform for 35 years and has stopped distinguishing between posture and identity. His face was professionally unreadable, which is a genuine skill, and he carried it with the ease of long practice. He looked at me when I entered. "Captain." "Sir, you've made quite a name for yourself." "I didn't ask to, sir." He nodded once, moved from the window to the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back. "Journalists are calling," he said. "A senator from the Armed Services Committee has requested a formal briefing. Veterans organizations are organizing with specific legislative asks, and you," a pause that had weight in it, "have become the face of something considerably larger than 1 officer and 1 base." I looked at him and waited. "Captains don't lead movements," he said. The sentence was both a statement and a warning. It was the institutional version of what Hargrove had been saying for 6 weeks in cruder forms. Know your place. Stay in your lane. Understand that the boundaries were drawn by someone else, and your job is to operate within them without raising questions about who drew them or why. I said, "Neither does covering for abusers, sir." The room went still in a particular way. Behind his desk, Huxley made a small movement, not a flinch, something smaller than a flinch, but carrying the same fundamental quality of a man absorbing an impact he had not fully anticipated. Caldwell looked at me with the expression I had been unable to read in his face from the beginning, layered, moving in more than one direction simultaneously. Then Huxley spoke. He said, "Sir, with respect, the story's already out. We either lead the conversation or we get buried in it." I noted this carefully. It was the first time in 6 weeks at Fort Ashwood that a senior officer within Hargrove's institutional orbit had said something that acknowledged the actual shape of events, rather than the preferred version of them. It was not heroism, it was pragmatism aligned with truth, which is a less dramatic thing than principle, but arrives at the same place and is sometimes more durable. Caldwell exhaled slowly. "Fine," he said, "then we manage it." He turned back to me. "You're being reassigned to Westfield Command. Publicly, it is a promotion. The framing, the timing, the communication, everything will reflect a career advancement." He paused. "Privately, it is a firebreak." I looked at him for a moment. "Sir," I said, "with respect, you're not silencing me, you're amplifying me." He didn't answer. He held my eyes for a moment with that layered, unresolvable expression. Then he nodded once, turned and walked out of the office. His footsteps were clean and measured down the corridor, the sound of an institution moving to manage something it no longer controls. Huxley and I were alone. He looked at me across his desk. Something in his expression had changed, something that was not entirely official, that belonged to him rather than to his rank. He said, "For what it's worth, Captain." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I said, "Yes, sir." I left. What I didn't know yet, walking back out into the September afternoon, was what Cal Fenwick had already done. I found out 2 days later, the morning before my transfer to Westfield, in the motor pool at 0600. The same space where all the things that had actually mattered in the past 6 weeks had been communicated in the flatness of early morning in plain language without ceremony. Lauren said Fenwick sent the audio to Military Times. I stopped. When? Day after the exercise ground. I stood with that for a moment, the 43 seconds. Hargrove's voice clear, issuing a direct operational order to a soldier in my unit without reference to my command. 43 seconds of evidence that the pattern was not interpretation, not inference, not one officer's reading of a complicated situation. It was documented, time-stamped, and real. Fenwick had not come to me. He had not asked permission. He had not run it through the calculation that most people run it through, weighing the cost of action against the cost of silence, factoring in their own exposure, considering the institutional forces arrayed on the other side of the decision. He had simply identified the right thing and done it because he was 19 years old, and apparently arrived already understanding what most people spend years figuring out, that silence in the face of something wrong is itself a choice, and choices have consequences, and the consequences of that particular choice are borne by people who have no say in the matter. Is he going to face any Whitfield got to it? Lauren said. He's covered. I nodded. I thought about what to say. Everything I thought of was either too much or not sufficient. So I said what was true and let it be enough. Make sure he knows it mattered. It. Not from me, just make sure he knows it, son. Lauren said he knows. The Military Times article ran the following morning. I read it on my laptop in my quarters with the window open, the early morning, coming through in its particular way, cooler now than it had been in August, the first suggestion that the season might eventually change. The article was careful and specific, which is what good work looks like regardless of the field. It used the audio, it used the documented pattern, it used Vess's statement, which had entered the formal record and was therefore part of the accessible account. It told the story of Fort Ashwood as what it was, not a single incident on an exercise ground, but the conclusion of something that had been building for 6 years and had been documented quietly and at personal cost by people who understood that documentation was the only form of resistance that could not be dismissed. It mentioned Webb. It mentioned him properly by name and rank and what had been done to him, which was what he deserved to be, part of the record accurately, not as a footnote. I closed the laptop. I sat for a few minutes with nothing in particular, the morning doing its morning work around me, the bass outside beginning to find its rhythm for the day, boots on pavement equipment, checked voices calling across the distance between buildings. The sound of an institution doing its work, which is what it sounds like when things are functioning as they should. I thought about my mother sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded, telling me something that had taken me a long time to become ready to receive. Some lessons require the right circumstances before they become practical. This one had required 11 years and 6 weeks at Fort Ashwood. I opened my desk drawers and took out the 3 pieces of paper I had kept there since the beginning of August. The memo with its 4 altered sentences, I put this in my transfer file where it belonged as part of the formal record. It had served its purpose as evidence. Now it would serve its purpose as documentation. The letter, 5 words, no name. He's losing face, be ready. I put this in the transfer file as well. It had oriented me at the moment I needed orienting, and its place now was in the accounting of what had happened, where it could be read in the context of everything that came after it. The drawing I held for a long moment. Rough pencil lines on plain white paper. A soldier at a line facing forward. Behind her, an enormous shadow with one hand raised. The soldier was not looking back. 5 words above it in careful block letters. Strength isn't loud, it just doesn't move. I folded it once along the vertical, once along the horizontal. I put it in my breast pocket. The left side, the same side that holds a Purple Heart when you're wearing it for the occasions that require it. The pocket felt right with the drawing in it, fuller, more honest, the weight of something earned rather than issued. I put on my cover, picked up my transfer bag, and went outside. The Texas morning was doing what Texas mornings do in the second week of September, building toward heat, the sky moving from pale gray to pale gold, the shadows long and pointed as the sun came up over the eastern perimeter fence. The base was assembling itself around me. Boots on pavement, a vehicle moving in the motor pool, the flag at the top of the parade ground pole catching the first reliable wind of the day. Private Cal Fenwick was standing at the end of the walkway. He was in full uniform, chin strap clipped correctly properly this time, without the casual inattention of a man who hasn't yet decided how much the details matter. He had the posture of someone who had arrived early and deliberately, who had decided something about this moment and had given himself enough time to be certain of the decision before it arrived. When he saw me, he straightened. He said, "Captain." I stopped. I looked at him. 19 years old, 4 months at Fort Ashwood. A private who had asked a good question in a field exercise 8 weeks ago and had written the answer in a small green notebook. Who had been standing 12 feet from a colonel issuing an illegal order and had press record not out of calculation or ambition or dramatic intention, but out of the simple, clear understanding that documenting what is true is itself a form of responsibility. He held my eyes. Steady in a way that 19-year-olds are not always steady in a way that comes from having made a decision and being at peace with the cost of it. He said, "Safe travels, ma'am." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "Take care of this base." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He meant it. I could hear it. The kind of yes that isn't a response to an instruction, but a statement of intent. I kept walking, not because the moment didn't matter, it mattered considerably, but because what Fenwick had done, what Lorne had spent 17 months building, what Vess had finally found the courage to say what Webb had endured, all of it pointed forward rather than back. The work of the past 6 weeks was not something to stand inside and examine. It was foundation. What happened next was built on it or it wasn't, and the building was not mine to do anymore. It belonged to the people standing in it. My vehicle was waiting at the main gate. A corporal from the motor pool who gave me a look when I put my bag in the back. Not a salute, not a formal acknowledgement. A look that communicated something in the language of people who have been through the same thing from different positions and understand each other without needing to explain. I got in. Fort Ashwood moved past the windows as we drove toward the gate. The motor pool with its lights. The barracks. The parade ground with the flag moving properly now in a wind that had found its purpose. The administrative wing and its fluorescent quiet. The exercise ground, the hard pan red and flat in the early light, still marked with the boot prints of what had happened there 12 days ago. I looked at it as we passed. 11 seconds on 3 camera angles. A raised hand, a crack like a live round, a voice that did not shake, not the beginning of something. The end of something that had been a long time ending, and the beginning of whatever the people standing in that ground would decide to build in the space it left behind. The gate opened. We drove through. The road spread out ahead of us, flat and straight, the hard pan running on both sides under a sky that had opened up into the full, enormous Texas morning, pale and clear and honest in the way that wide country is honest. Nothing to hide behind, no cover, no shadow large enough to stand in. I thought about Whitfield in the fluorescent quiet of Conference Room C, reading Vess's statement with the careful neutrality of a man who has been handed something true and is in the process of deciding what his responsibility to it is. About Huxley behind his desk making that small movement when the right sentence was finally spoken aloud in his office. About Caldwell walking out with his measured footsteps carrying an institution's attempt to manage something that had already grown past managing. About Webb somewhere outside the story now, his file being read properly for the first time 14 months late and not too late. About Lorne in the motor pool at this hour going back to his maintenance log with the particular attention of a man who has done what needed doing and is returning without ceremony to the work that remains. About Fenwick at the end of the walkway, chin strap clipped, saying yes the way you say it when you mean something by it. I put my hand to my breast pocket. The folded drawing was there, the pencil lines, the soldier who was not looking back. Still water runs deep, and still water cuts the hardest. My mother's words across a kitchen table in a house where a Marine Corps officer's cover sat on the table and certain things were understood without being said. She had been talking about character, about the kind of strength that does not need to announce itself, that does its work quietly and completely, and leaves the evidence in what it has built rather than what it has declared. She did not know when she said it what it would mean 24 years later, on a road leaving Fort Ashwood, Texas in the early morning of a day that was already becoming something different from the day before it. She was just telling me something true about the world in the way that she told me true things directly without ornament, trusting me to understand what to do with it. I understood now. I straightened in the seat, put my hands in my lap, faced the road ahead. They tried to bury the story, All they did was plant it.